Today we're going to talk about the U.S. Farm Bill, which is supposed to happen every 5 years. It never does. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 8, I think. And something one's expecting it to get done on time this year either. We've got two great experts to join us. We've got Alexandra Bookis, who's the Senior Manager of Government Affairs at Sanctuary, and we've got Christina Badaracco, who is a author, or educator, dietitian, and author of a book called The Farm Bill, the Citizen's Guide. So please join me in welcoming them for today's event.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about the Farm Bill, as Chris said, and specifically how we can shift Farm Bill and what those opportunities represent in fact communities around the country, food systems, animals, people, and the environment. Sure. Thanks, Chris. We're checking the IT. So Christina's going to get us started, as she is an expert and educator about the Farm Bill. Christina will get us started going through what the Farm Bill covers and all the other titles that she needs to Farm Bill. When she's done, I'm going to take you through what advocacy on the Farm Bill looks like in a Farm Bill year. I live in a base in Washington, D.C., where I lobby on the Farm Bill. We can talk about what advocacy looks like. And I'm like, Christina, to get started.
Thanks so much for coming today. I'm really excited to have a chance to talk with you. So my name is Christina Badaracco. I actually work full-time in healthcare companies. I'm a dietitian by training, and for a very long time I've been very passionate about the intersection of human and environmental health through our systems. I also have written and researched and taught a lot about that community.
Yeah, I guess we're gonna now we're good. Okay.
All right. So as Alex said, I'll start off with a little bit of an overview of the Farm Bill, and then share a little bit more about issues related to nutrition, given that it's often an area and then we end with some recommendations for positive change. Okay, so this slide is, I'm sure, nothing new to most of you in the room. I'm often to healthcare providers, and nothing new to most of you in the room. I'm often to healthcare providers and others who might not be as familiar, but just as a reminder what this is saying, and about on the right hand side, the Farm Bill is authorized every 5 years, sometimes it's a bit more than that. There are some programs funded through the Farm Bill that rely on appropriated funds each year. So just because something is put into the Farm Bill, a certain amount of money doesn't mean it will actually get that amount of money each year. So on this slide, I'm going to share briefly a little bit about what is included in the Farm Bill. So there are 12 titles, title being essentially a category with a variety of programs in it. So the image you see on the left is actually pulled from the book, and so you can see that the nutrition title is by far the largest title. Accounting for it's increased a little bit in recent years, but typically somewhere between about 75 and even closer to 85% of the funds. The other three largest in terms of dollars are crop insurance, conservation, and commodity funding. Altogether, those account for roughly 99% of funding through the Farm Bill, and then another 8 titles account for less than 1%. Okay, so this is a graph that I pulled from the Congressional Research Service report, which has been a great source of information for me as I was working on my book to get an idea of how funds are used, what is within each title of the Farm Bill, et cetera. So I mentioned in the previous slide that 4 of the 12 titles that for the vast majority of them from the Farm Bill, nutrition being the largest. And I guess a couple of things I'll point out on this graph. We're looking over the last just over 30 years on this slide, recent history, and then getting into the future. So nutrition has over this time been the largest title, but it has not always been 80+%. So there have been a couple points in history where the nutrition title has increased substantially. One being coming out of the Great Recession in 2008, And a couple of years ago, we modified the 30 food plan that determines what the amount that beneficiaries can receive, and that was another example of a change that led to an increase in spending in SNAP. Let's see. One other item I'll point out, we see a little bit of a shift if you look at the blue and the red bars in this graph when it comes to commodity spending. So until, let's see, maybe a couple of decades ago, the commodity title was the title that involved most funds going to commodity crops. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's in these titles in just a minute. We've seen from the shift of the last couple of decades to the crop insurance title actually being larger than the commodity title and being more of a source for subsidies for largely commodity crops, as we'll talk about. Okay, and this is another graph. This is a pie chart that shows projected spending under the 18 Farm Bill, which is the most recent one that was signed at the time. It was signed in 2018, so usually again estimated to be about 6. So I'll spend just a moment talking a little bit more about the top 4 titles to give you an idea of what is included in those. So the nutrition and just so you know the numbers here, they are not a number in terms of size, they're the number as the Farm Bill is written. So the nutrition title being the numbers of the parties. So by far the largest program in the nutrition title is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which was formerly known as food stamps. So that's what gets the most attention. That is what is typically most hotly debated as we are going to reauthorize the Farm Bill. But there are several others as well. The Emergency Food Assistance Program, Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program, and one that has increased recently and received permanent funding, the Industry Micronutrition Incentive Program. Just like saying, and then there are more as well. Crop insurance, second largest title. So that includes programs that basically support farmers who are participating in the federal crop insurance program. A few other examples: the staff income protection plan, supplemental coverage option, and one that I think is exciting and a lot of advocates interested in sustainable agriculture think we need to emphasize further the whole farm revenue protection program, which looks at diversified forms of agriculture, whereas most other farms that have policies under federal crop insurance are typically monoculture, so growing maybe just 1 or 2 largely commodity crops. The commodities title, the first title includes things like price loss coverage, agricultural risk coverage, a new program under the last Farm Bill, dairy margin coverage. There are a variety of other supports. And when I say commodities, by the way, if you haven't heard that term before, that is referring to things like corn, soy, wheat, some of the crops that we grow in very large volume, often used in trade, often end up in very highly processed food or not even food at all, as we talk about later on the slide. We use them for a variety of purposes. The fourth largest title is the conservation title. So there are a couple of types of programs we see historically, I guess, for being categorized with conservation programs. One being working lands programs, and the other being set-aside programs. So working lands programs, something like the environmental quality incentives program. So those are funds used to support implementation of conservation practices on farmland that is being actively used. Whereas something like the conservation reserve program is a set-aside program. So those funds are used to actually encourage farmers to not use land for a certain amount of time, let it rest, let its nutrients regenerate so that it can be used more sustainably in the long term. Okay. And the remaining titles, for the sake of time, I'm not going to walk through in detail, but this slide shows in general what some of these different titles cover. So, for example, the trade title supports export programs and international food aid. Something else I will point out, the horticulture title, number 10, is the one that includes block grants for specialty crops being the term that USDA refers to the foods that I, as a dietitian, and I think most of you are usually vulnerable to people's plates, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, etc. We also work in agriculture, things like cost sharing for helping farmers to transition to organic agriculture. Okay. I'm going to slide here to just show a little bit of the history of farm bills in the United States. So the first farm bill was signed in 1933. Each farm bill is a general name. We reauthorize that and roughly every 5 years, but each bill that's signed. First one, Agricultural Investment Act of 1933. Most recent in 2018 was the Agricultural Improvement Act. And so here you can kind of see the years and the names over time. And then I wanted to just highlight a couple of pretty substantial changes over time. A subset, of course, there are definitely differences in farm bills. The first one was signed as part of the New Deal coming out of the Great Depression. In the 1970s, we saw food stamps, standards are now called food assistance, become a permanent part of the farm bill, so they're been included in everyone's consent. We saw conservation title added in the 1980s. So that was very exciting. We saw requirements for SNAP education that were added in the early 2000s. And then in the 2014 Farm Bill, we saw more of a focus on these nutrition incentive programs. Again, being dietitian, I think that's particularly exciting for folks in my field. We did also see more support for beginning that is very important for and then to talk a little bit more about what changed in the 2018 Farm Bill. Pretty briefly here, just a couple of these bullets. So we may have heard that through the Farm Bill, we actually legalized hemp production in the United States. This Farm Bill, we had a couple of very important programs for supporting beginning and young and disadvantaged farmers for getting into agriculture. Also, the local agriculture marketing program with land, which became permanent. And that is really important for small local farmers to be able to market and sell their products. Let's see, I mentioned before we had permanent funding for what used to be called the Food Insecurity Nutrition Incentive Program, and is now FSNIP for the Nutrition Incentive Program. And then there were also, I'd say, full of not so positive aspects. One example, the last bullet there in the meeting, we actually had some reduced restrictions on what chemicals could be used in organic agriculture through this Farm Bill. And then we had a big expansion in terms of which family members are eligible to receive commodity programs. So I've heard people call it the 23andMe rule before. And so, in conclusion, in summary, there were some positive changes that were made, but at the time this Farm Bill was signed, most people largely considered it a status quo. And I'll spend a couple of minutes walking through some of the sort of large scale impacts throughout history of the Farm Bill on our food system, on public health, the environment, etc. And a few of these are pulling images from my book as well. So I mentioned a minute ago that there has been some increase in terms of funding and support for beginning and disadvantaged farmers in the Farm Bill. And this is really important because we are at this point in industry, we have a real shortage of farmers in the United States. We have fewer people in farming, and actually just to focus on this slide for a minute, we have seen over the last 50, 70 years drastic increase in the average size of farms in the United States, and a drastic decrease in the number of farms as many farms have consolidated. And as I mentioned before, we have a deficit in young farmers in the United States. This is an image that shows the share of beginning farmers by county. Beginning farmers are what USDA identifies as those principal operators who have been working on their operations for 10 years or less. We also have a problem with where our subsidy dollars are going. So most are going to wealthiest farms, the biggest and wealthiest farms in the United States. And this is a image that I repurposed from some data from the Heritage Foundation. So the largest family farms, or what USDA identifies as family farms in the United States, that already have the greatest household wealth, represent just under 3% of all farms in the United States, yet get more than a third of all commodity subsidies, and almost half that amount for subsidies that we're giving need to make are contribute to that problem of farms consolidating, getting bigger and bigger. Our planted acreage is predominantly consisting of corn and soy, as well as other commodities. So corn and soy together account for about 70%, meat being the third largest for almost 20%. And then, as I hinted earlier, we don't even use all of our crops for food, and it seems like this graph is a little bit smushed, so hopefully you can still see that. So only about 10% of the corn, our largest supply in the U.S. is actually used for food, which I'm not sure everybody realizes. So almost 40% goes primarily to animal feed, livestock feed, and then almost 30% goes to produce ethanol. And we export a fairly substantial amount. And then one final thing I'll point out on this slide as well, even if 10% ends up in the food supply, that 10% is not all fresh ears of corn that we like to enjoy every summer. That's including a substantial amount for having those corn syrup and other derivatives, again, highly processed food that is not good for people. And then this is an image we have in our book that shows some of the images, some of the negative impacts of Cornification of America. So, for example, we see the image of the southern country with this overproduction of corn that largely results in unhealthy processed foods. One factor contributing to the increased prevalence of obesity. We have problems with a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico when most of the corn they're producing requires a large amount of inputs related to pollution and water supply and also fish and the water. Okay, and then a couple more points about nutrition. So, if any of you in the room are familiar with our dietary guidelines, developed directly by USDA services, also for 7 years. So the problem for dietary guidelines don't align at all with our subsidies. So you may have seen the USDA My Plate, which you will, it recommends at least half the plate fruits and vegetables. If you look on the right, this is an image I recreated for a group called Farm Action recently. Fruits and vegetables receive about 4%. I think that may be 16 smaller numbers before in terms of subsidy dollars. So it's definitely in alignment with what we're recommending people eat and the way we spend our subsidy dollars. And then partially as a result of factors leading to this, diets in the United States do not align at all with our dietary guidelines. Again, the dietary guidelines, what we will. When we see the blue bars on this graph, by the way, those are the subgroups of foods. If you can't quite see the text on the left-hand side, we see different types of vegetables, dark green, the red and orange vegetables, for example. The blue are those food groups for which Americans are deficient. And then the purple are the foods for which Americans are consuming too much. So no surprise, we're consuming far too much refined grains, not nearly enough fruits and vegetables, etc. Okay, and then so a few examples of recent issues like with respect to the Farm Bill. I won't go into detail on some of these, but you may be aware. So especially coming out of the pandemic, we've had a lot of disruptions in our food supply. We've had a lot of shortages, increase in food insecurity. Also through the change in the 50 plan that determines the benefits that people receive, that's led to a drastic increase in spending. So actually, tonight I had a hearing yesterday. I was watching the recording last night, and there's certainly a lot of debate. We need to do something to reduce spending on this program because it has increased substantially even in just the last couple of years. The war in Ukraine, for example, continued effects of climate change, funding through the Inflation Reduction Act to address climate change, changes in consumer trends, more people looking for meat and dairy alternatives. And a variety of ways that different tools of stimulus funding were used. So there are a lot of different issues that are being reflected in the debates and discussions about what should be in the food waste being another issue. This is an example of like later my co-author and I published in the Exclude America website. This was 2021, looking at the subsidies food waste and hunger in the early pandemic. I talked already a little bit about SNAP, there's a couple of examples to show you where you see actually underutilization of SNAP in the United States on the left, for eligible is actually participating, and then you see some of the bumps in that bar graph on the right over time where we've seen an increase spending. And then briefly, I'll reiterate, there have been a lot of debates, ideas, discussions about how we can improve, strengthen the SNAP program in the United States, particularly given that we spend so much as well, given that we know Americans' diets continue to get worse and worse, Americans' health overall continues to get worse and worse. So how can we optimize dietary intake health outcomes, in particular for this vulnerable population? So, for example, calls for better aligning SNAP to Medicaid. Medicaid eligibility varies state to state, but so there's not necessarily always perfect overlap, but generally speaking, there are many Americans who are participating in both. I would argue as somebody who also does a lot of work in the culinary medicine space, we need more of a focus in SNAP Ed, the education component of SNAP on empowering people with basic cooking skills. So just because we give them benefits by helping them, they know what to do with them, they have the right equipment, they know what to do in their kitchens. Further down, there's a lot of research looking into incentives and disincentives, a lot of it coming from Tufts, as well as a little bit of this work, but also there is some good evidence to suggest more shifting for incentives for home use can really impact what people are buying for improvement. And then finally, there are also advocates who are looking for separating SNAP from the farm that it would be easier to make some. And then so I've given several examples of problems in the Farm Bill and how those lead to problems that our society. So I think as you'll hear in Alex's portion of the presentation, some different proposed legislation in the past, there are many examples of positive changes that can be made. One, the orange image here, so imposing real income limits for who's actually receiving subsidies, both commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies in the United States, so we can stop against supporting the big producers who are getting even bigger. Simply involving conservation compliance requirements for subsidy recipients, because at this point in time, there is no real requirement for them to be implementing conservation practices and any others as well. An example of some recommendations, I just finished up a tenure for my professional association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Farm Bill Task Force, putting together some recommendations to better promote primarily interested in reading that. With that, I will turn it over to Thomas.
All right, thank you, Christina. I'm going to reintroduce myself briefly because my mic wasn't on at the beginning for the people joining us virtually. My name is Alexandra Bookis, and I manage government affairs for Farm Sanctuary. We're a national nonprofit organization with about 1.8 million followers, advocating for more just, sustainable, and compassionate food systems to advance the interests of people, animals, and the planet. So we'll also bring in what animals interest me during the farm year. We also do operate 2 farm-to-table sanctuaries, one in New York, one in California. So if you're ever there, please see us. For the outline, I'm going to take you through just a brief capture of what it would mean to pass a farm bill that maintains the status quo. Christina did an amazing job, especially covering the nutrition part of that bill. So I'm going to move a little bit more into environmental, public health, and animal interests. We're also going to talk about what shifting the farm bill means, and I'll use the Food and Farm Act, which is a bill that was introduced. I had the pleasure of working on that with Congressman Earl Hour and his team in March, what it means to do farm bill reform through a title-by-title approach. Then we're going to talk about what federal advocacy on all of these issues looks like under a big tent, representing a range of cross-sector interests, and we'll conclude with community-based advocacy and opportunities to get involved for everybody, including everyone. Okay, so what happens if the 2023 Farm Bill maintains the status quo? If the 2023 Farm Bill looks like the 2018 Farm Bill, then essentially only big ag or big agriculture, as we call them, the millionaire landowners and the billionaire investors will truly benefit from the Farm Bill's factory food system approach to investments. It will also reinvest in a model that perpetuates needless suffering, largely through animal agriculture. So just some brief stats on nutrition spending. Christina covered this so well. 85% of the $700 billion of expected funding will go to critical nutrition spending. That money, for example, through SNAP, is needed to support 40 million families and more every year. However, when we look at the results of that spending, according to the CDC, more than 9 in 10 adults in the United States are nutritionally insecure. When you measure their food vegetable consumption. We often talk about food insecurity, and we're on a pathway to talking more and more about nutritional security, about the quality of food that people are eating and not just the quantity. So we need to support nutritional security nation. Today's food system is also at a point where it's there's food is medicine, right, which is so critical in food, right, but it also clarifies for us that what the state of the food system is, that our fruits and vegetables are not cornerstone of that system in ways that they should be. Farm bill spending can also be better leveraged to invest in that nutritional security. That can mean advancing policies like universal nutrition incentives and SNAP for fruits and vegetables, food programs like GovSNP, which Christina mentioned in her presentation, so that no matter whether you're shopping at a large farmer's market or a corner store, you have access to those fruits and vegetables. We're actually working on a bill right now, standalone to advance that policy. So the top 1% of borrowers were responsible for 52% of farm credit system debt. And this is starting to look at what we call the factory farm investment model in the farm bill. Those are folks who got loans of $5 million or more. Similarly, the top 7% of recipients of commodity subsidies received nearly 70% of all payments. So when we look at those two graphs, we can see that the credit and the direct to farm payments set up a system of guaranteed profits for those millionaire landowners and the billionaire customers. And then when we look at insurance spending, 7 in 10 insurance dollars support revenue protection, not fuel protection. So when you hear crop insurance, you might think it is natural disaster. Those insurance dollars are going to be used to protect that crop. But that's not what we're doing. We're protecting revenue. And so when you keep those costs low and the revenues per acre is high, what the system is doing is fueling consolidation and essentially guaranteeing the profits for folks growing the feed, the fuel, and those foreign exports, not the food that nourishes people. So in sum, we've created a debt system that subsidizes the largest landowners and an insurance program that protects the produce. I also think it's really important for us to acknowledge that we have structural inequalities built into this factory food investment model. So, for example, if you look at these charts, farmers who identify as Black or Indigenous do not benefit from federal programs at the same levels as farmers that's white, receiving about half of government payments. And also we look at land ownership, farmers who identify as white own more than 94% of U.S. farmland. So when we have a federal credit, insurance, and conservation payment system that A, rewards land ownership and B, rewards production, we're ultimately also reinforcing the structural basis of it. Now, conservation spending. I often call this also just conservation as greenwashing because conservation funding does not prioritize our highest return on investment or ROI programs. The Union of Concerned Scientists, an amazing organization, found that the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP, their whole farm approach had a much higher ROI than the other two major conservation programs. Yet, CSP funding fell from 2016 to 19 as other programs grew. The conservation funding that we put forth in the Farm Bill also does not prioritize our reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So most conservation funding goes to either cover cropping, commodity producers, or industrial properties on factory farms. Essentially, we're paying factory farms to pollute, and then we're paying them again to cover up the mess. And these are unjust solutions, and also ones that rural communities around the country actively reject and fight through the legal system to address the harms of these solutions, such as biogas also. So the Farm Bill often also excludes humans and non-human beings' interests alike. For example, we have talked about workers today, but the farm and food chain workers, their well-being has largely been excluded through major farm system legislation over the last century. You saw Christina's map, not a lot on there over the last century covering workers. Also, animal law and policy students, you may know that the Animal Welfare Act does not protect farmed animals. In fact, the only law that codifies their entitlements is the Humane Slaughter Act. But that bill excludes more than 95% of farmed animals, who are the chickens and other bird species in our food system. And now we also know that our well-being of farmed animals on the planet is interconnected, right? Nowhere is that clearer right now than in pandemic preparedness, where 3 in 4 new infectious diseases are the mounting origin of disease. So, shifting the Farm Bill, I work with Capitol Hill. I'm a lobbyist, and we're not just going to talk about the problems with the system today. We're also going to talk about some of those solutions and what coalitions and advocates and other organizations are doing around the country to try to change this. To build good systems that work for everyone, we have to shift the Farm Bill from public investments that serve as a big ag bailout to investments that can build the good, as we like to say in Farm Dictionary, for people, for animals, and for the planet. So in a minute, I'm going to take us through the Food and Farm Act, the bill that was introduced for Farm Bill reform. But I want to be very clear that there are a number of incredible bills that have been proposed, federal standalone legislation on Capitol Hill, coming from Senator Booker, from Representative Pingree, from Representative Kamala Jayapal, and Representatives Velazquez and Bowman. And so lobbyists work in coalitions to advance bills like the Farm System Reform Act, the Agricultural Resilience Act, the Transparency and Depopulation Act, the Health Teacher Students, and the Health Program Act. That one's a mouthful. We work on all of those to try to get them through Congress, but in the Farm Bill year, we also have the opportunity to say, what can we pull from those bills? What language, what policy can we lobby on to try to get that included in the Farm Bill? So, a bill, I had the pleasure of moderating the bill introduction event with the Food and Farm Act DC in March. This is from Congressman Earl Blumenauer from a district in Portland, in Oregon. He is the co-chair of the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus. Now, this is actually the top of the one-pager for his bill, the Food and Farm Act, where he's describing what the Farm Bill is. Christina took us through that, but also a brief summary of the problems we talked about today, and then getting at the solution. Those 4 principles in this bill are focusing resources on those who need most, fostering innovation, encouraging investments in people and the planet, and also animals, and ensuring access to healthy food. At the bill intro event, the Congressman gave a quote that I loved. He said, we give too much money to the wrong people to grow the wrong food in the wrong places. Congress can and should do better. The bill is 130 pages. I'm not going to take us through that today. I'm also not going to take us through the title by title section, but I am going to give you, if you want to read the bill, let me know, I'll email it to you. But we are going to go through a summary of what each title is and does. So, Title 1, and you'll see the titles are different than what is in like the main Farm Bill. It's sort of an alternative vision for what it could look like. So, note that state. Title 1, commodities and crop insurance. We're going to cut, cap, and clarify the existing farm subsidy programs while increasing access for farmers who grow more than one crop commodities. Title 2, conservation. We're going to expand and reform existing conservation programs for better results, right? Let's invest in the ones that are doing true conservation work, greenwashing. Title 3, food assistance. Increasing the reach and efficacy of our food assistance programs. Title 4, increased access to healthy food and food deserts. Those are also referred to as food apartheid, a great term coined by activist leader in the business standards, and other underserved areas, schools and farmers markets through SNAP and other initiatives. We're going to provide resources to beginning, retiring, and socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. If you remember the graphs of who's getting federal investments as farmers right now, we need to support the young farmers and those who don't regularly have access to government aid. Title 6, establishing a food waste title to better prioritize food waste reduction. We've talked a lot about food waste today, but that represents a huge loss of food to humans and also represents major issues with sustainability. Research extension and related matters. We have to invest in research programs to understand what's working on the farms for sustainability and to help farmers navigate a changing climate. If you've heard about what's happening in California and other areas with droughts and with natural disasters, we need to have research to know how to address that moving forward. The existing farm bill, does not have a title on animal welfare. It does not include animal interests. The bill has a title on animal welfare, specifically in reforming USDA's research and organic programs to ensure that federal dollars support the humane treatment of animals. I will say this bill represents steps in the right direction for shifting the Farm Bill for that reform. That is also why we lobby on all those other bills I talked about. And we support vibrant local regional food systems. And This is a photo of the introduction event. I just wanted to share. We took on this over here. We brought in experts from across the food system working in farming, public health, nutrition, social justice to give testimony on their work and state why the bill is so expensive. The bill is so important. It's expensive. We're talking about billions of dollars, so that maybe wasn't it's out there. I also want to clarify we do stuff like this with press and nationally. We bring in also support from experts nationally across the food system. So getting votes from people like Marianne Nessel at New York University. You may know Kathy Kessler, director of Annual Education at the George Washington University, came to DC with her students. We do federal advocacy in a big tent with farmers and workers, people working in sustainability, nutrition, healthcare practitioners, social justice, health, and animals. And this is what when I say a big tent, it's all of those cross-sector interests coming together in this bill and another federal legislation. Okay, there we go. Also, it is not just our organization, Dietary. We work in coalitions with a huge range of organizations across the movement. These are just a number of the endorsements of the Food and Farm Act. I didn't get everyone's logo on that slide, but I got some of the early signers up there. So folks like Open Markets Institute, Rogue Farm Corps, Friends of the Earth, Food and Water Watch, Taxpayers for Common Sense, Independent Restaurant Coalition. When there is a bill that represents interests across the system for everybody, we reflect that in endorsing the legislation, and then that's what the bodies do. We get to work together for bills that advance shared progress. Why? Because food can advance shared priorities. For if you're in health, diet-related disease remains the top cause of death in the United States. If sustainability is concerned, 33% of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems, but only 3% of our public climate finance goes to food system interventions. There. And supporting private, rural, and urban economies, social justice. More likely to live near traffic pollution to identify Blacks and Indigenous. I want to note North Carolina. There's a lot of amazing work happening at the state level right now to combat the effects of factory farming on rural communities. And animal well-being. More than 10 billion land and farm animals are raised in the United States, most in factory farm conditions, and they also reflect 40% of land in the continental United States. I want to be clear also that the best thing we can do for farm animals well-being is to reduce the number of animals in the U.S. business supply chain. Welfare is important, but the system-wide approach to reducing that number is critical. I also focused on land farmed animals today. I'm sure there are people here who care about aquatic animals as well. And advancing aquatic animals' interests and well-being is also essential. I am happy to share that we will be the first of our national focus next year for Aquatic Animal Day in DC and George Washington. So we're working on it. It's just not as exclusively tied to the farm bill. I also just want to give you a sense before we wrap up of, in general, what a policy advocacy strategy that is cross-sector can look like. So we elevate food. Because federal policymakers deprioritize food, and food matters. Food matters to drive outcomes in health, sustainability, all of those other needs and goals that we talked about today. And to advance that, to elevate that food, we apply across movement, resource-based approach to advocacy. We have all the resources that we need to nourish people in ways that would dramatically reduce harms to animals, people, and the planet. So we just all have to work together to ultimately put that purpose over profit to shift those federal investments in our business. And wrapping it up once more, we integrate nutrition and sustainability priorities to catalyze the equitable cross-sector approaches that are community driven. Whenever we're recommending policy change, that follows months of outreach to community-based organizations to understand what is working in communities, what you need more support to do, so that we're reflecting that lived experience in policy advocacy. To reorient to advance economic, environmental, and racial justice for sustainable farm opportunity, universal nutritional security, and justice across the food system supply chain for people and for animals. So that was kind of a lot. If you're thinking like, oh no, what do we do? We are working on it. There are positive impacts. I wanted to, Christina and I put this together. We put this slide together. Positive impacts you can have as well as policy students. Publishing research that you're working on to help build a set of evidence base for valuable programs and other articles. Learning, please stay up to date about the Farm Bill, subsidies, Farm Sanctuary puts out blogs on these issues. There are CRS reports, National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition gives updates, farm action, the information's there to be provided. Testify. If there's a bill that's up for debate in the state, in the local city council, you have the ability to submit a written or oral testimony at hearings for mission like those that advance interests that you care about. Advocate for those policies at the local, state, and national levels for nutritional security, sustainable practices, small farms, and animal welfare. Please write to your legislators and submit verbal comments. Happy to connect with anybody about the bills we're working on. We need to hear from all over the country from citizens, people in the United States who care. Spending your dollars wisely at markets, grocery stores, and farms that invest in those local economies and can keep small family farms in business. There are clinics here. Engage in legal work through clinics, apply for internships, fellowships, positions in the movement, and later on, you can provide pro bono services to beginning farms and community-based organizations who need support in the legal system. Finally, educating others, sharing information, mentoring other students, especially for me. I'm going to hand it to Christina to take us through some recommended meeting, and then we'll do questions.
So to wrap up briefly, we wanted to share a few examples of resources. Alex said there's a lot of information. If you want to read more about the Farm Bill, you can read each bill itself if you want, but to find other sorts of information. So my book that was published in the beginning of 2019, I believe it will be available tomorrow. It is also available online. And there are a variety of other organizations which you've heard referenced. Farm Sanctuary's website, the Farm Bill Law Enterprise, Bipartisan Policy Center, they just published a report on making improvements to the SNAP program, Congressional Research Service reports, NSAP, Environmental Working Group. Those two organizations were really helpful for me as I was doing research for my book. Environmental Working Group, their subsidy database is really great if you want to get a better idea with commodities, which organizations, who's actually receiving subsidies. Farm actions, reports, and recommendations, and then other community-based authors who have written works reflecting diverse issues. And I think with that, we're happy to answer any questions.
What are the answer to the folks in here who are watching remotely? Were you that question? But
are we going to the organizations that seem to counter the hurdles that you bring forward? So how do the current beneficiaries organize themselves, and who, what would be the name of the organizations that present those counter arguments?
Yeah, those are largely industry interests. And so there are organizations like the National Pork Producers Council, the national companies and organizations that work in corn, soy, factory farming, meat production. Those are the groups that we have to sort of counter in DC when we're trying to advance this interest. And that is why it's really critical also that in our coalition, we have groups representing those interests as well, right? We have groups who represent farmers, who represent workers, who say that, those groups may claim to speak for the small farms, they may claim to speak for the family farms, but really they're looking for corporate interests. And so that's part of why the Big Ten is but those industries have a lot of money. As I said, I am the in-house lobbyist at a national nonprofit organization. There are hundreds of ag industry lobbyists in DC, and so that's why the coalition will work among nonprofit and community-based organizations. That's sort of our chance together.
questions?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I was curious if you could shed light on where grocery stores exist in this relationship. Because I guess farmers have a beneficiary interactions with food sales, not with farms. So if you just shed light on their smallness.
Sure, we'll start with Dietary. So as far as I would see it, I guess most of the relationship would be indirect. So with SNAP, just like other sort of federal nutrition programs, they're very often used at grocery stores. Not always, they can be used at farmers markets and other avenues, but they are typically using at this point what is called an EBT card, kind of like a debit card at grocery stores. So and maybe if you want to speak to advocacy in a minute, but I guess just to kind of generally speaking, we think of grocery stores. I'm not sure there's necessarily a direct interest one way or another. If we think about like healthier foods in Farm Bill or not, if we think about farmers markets and small farms themselves, I was actually just being interviewed for an article yesterday. I would certainly suggest that the more we have incentives for healthier foods through SNAP, for example, that's benefits the small farmers who are at farmers markets or like CSAs or wherever else they're using, because there's a greater percentage of each dollar spent on food going to farms rather than each step of processing on the supply chain. If we're talking about ultra processed foods. One other small item I'll mention, and I haven't seen a lot of data on this yet, but there was one new program, as a provider I found very exciting, investment program in the last Farm Bill to be used to produce prescriptions in particular, so pilot programs in which healthcare providers, just typically defined as physicians, although I think dietitians would love to expand that definition. And the pilot program happening in Washington, D.C. actually involves the giant grocery chain. Originally it was with farmers markets, and then I think it was decided we need to expand that to optimize accessibility. So AmeriHealth, Caritas, a Medicaid plan, Giant, and some other local stakeholders were partnering on this Farm Bill funded pilot program. So Giant certainly benefited because the prescription were to be used at Giant stores in particular. And I don't believe at this point we have seen data from the evaluations of these pilot programs yet, although we're certainly interested in seeing them. But at some point, I think we could see like all the different particular grocery stores that benefited from those pilot programs across the country. So that's at least one example of a concrete program that I think somewhat directly tied to the interests of grocery stores.
Happy to do the advocacy spin on that simply. In DC, I think the National Grocers Association would be the group that we work with. It's great people there. What Christina said about the EBT card is really important. In the GusNet program, the GusNet Shoemaker program, there's a program, for example, called Double Up Food Bucks, where you take $1 and you're on SNAP and you go to a market, and the government will match your dollar so that you pay for $2 or $1. The problem with programs, those programs are great. The problem is that they are most readily available at farmers markets. Now that's great for the farmers, but if you live in, for example, a really urban area and you're buying food at the corner store, at the local grocery store, that program might not be available. And so one of the bills that we're working on is to advance universal nutrition security by increasing healthy incentives programs. And what that bill does is gives a 30-cent cash back on a fruit or vegetable purchase when you spend $1, but also includes a tax incentive to stores because it costs money to implement the technology at stores to be able to process the EBT card, right? So sometimes when we're talking about that, we're getting into a little bit more wonky infrastructure funding that isn't as maybe clear from the get-go. So that infrastructure, and also we can look at channeling money down to the state level so that state departments and agencies have the ability to also support the implementation of those programs. Federal funding is great, but if we don't have the funding at the lower levels to actually go as far. So stores are really important because it's where most people are getting.
It was mentioned on one of the slides in South Threatened that they would try to bifurcate and take SNAP out of the Farm Bill. What do you think the implications of that?
Well, I guess it's a little bit hard, I guess, to wrap one's head around that because in our political climate, I don't think it's feasible, and I think many people have kind of made that clear. But separating, so I mean, I think There are some camps who might say it would be easier, faster to pass the farm bill without the SNAP in it, but I think it would also be a lot harder because when we think of the blue-red state divide, urban-rural divide, in terms of members of Congress, there are some people for whom SNAP is top priority, and that priority could be reduced spending on SNAP through various means. I don't think anybody, by the way, or whatever call for like eliminating SNAP. I think everybody knows like nutrition is important, food security is important, but more so like how do we be more efficient with the dollars we're spending on it. So yeah, some people focus really on reducing spending, maybe adding more work requirements. So they debate in terms of making sure that people participating are complying and spending, whereas other people would argue for increasing spending across the board and not thinking about any sort of restrictions. But I do think it would be, I mean, even if we split it out, I can imagine it would be really hard to pass a bill specifically focused on SNAP when members of Congress are so divided. Even if it is toward a common goal of improving diets for SNAP beneficiaries, how we go about doing that. We really do have a pretty strong sort of red blue divide. Which is unfortunate, I would say. Very unfortunate because, well.
Neither of you speak to Steve McCarthy and this his list of demands for raising the debt ceiling yesterday. A lot of it seem to impact different aspects of SNAP and parts of the Farm Bill. Can you speak to any of those?
See this from yesterday in particular.
Yeah, I managed to read up on that one. Get back to it. I know, look, it's just with all of, and this is what gets complicated, right? It's also appropriations, right? Like there's so many different things moving through Congress right now, but it is quietly unfortunate that the political divide has really fallen on staff, and with things like that, it's just further cutting into something that's going into that program. Now, there are parts of staff, maybe like educational programs or other things where cutting down on some of the funding wouldn't directly impact people's ability to get food as much. But I'm happy to get back to you on the McCarthy question. I think I need to read up on that one. Yeah, staying up to date with past seconds.
My last question here.
I was just curious about how the school lunch.
So, and that's maybe another good point of clarification, because I used a term like federal nutrition assistance programs a few times, and I think some people assume National School Lunch Program and also WIC, or Supplemental Nutrition Program for Infants and Children, fall under the Farm Bill. They don't. They're through the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. So that's kind of a separate, even though there's certainly overlap in terms of who's participating and what the goals are in promoting food security and nutrition security. So I think there are not a lot of, again, I'll kind of say there are, I'd say many ways in which the Farm Bill indirectly affects the school lunch program, like making certain commodities cheaper, for example, making them abundant, leading to a lot of the food processed foods that we see in school lunches. And then there are also some specific sources of funding for like farm to school, farm to institution programs, which I believe are grants. So like programs would be able to apply for those funds to be able to procure more food from local smaller farms that they would then use in their school lunch programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other piece of this is that this is part of why we see more standalone federal legislation that's introduced in Congress on school food, partly because of what Christina said about it not being as directly connected into the Farm Bill. There is a bill I want to highlight that we mentioned briefly. One is Senator Susan Collins' School Food Modernization Act. Just people are looking at good legislation that would impact school food. That's one. Another that I love beyond this is the Pilot Program Act, which would create a pilot program to give about $10 million, which would, I think, support about 50 schools around the country, money to serve healthy plant-based foods in their schools, but also has the funding for the training and infrastructure that's required to serve that. So it also bolsters the regional economies. That's all happening on its own. You'll see a lot of the food bills that are introduced separately for school food.
I did, also, I spent a summer during grad school working in the Oakland School District in their school lunch program, and I didn't know that this bill was on Senator Collins, but that's very exciting, because I can say absolutely firsthand, even if you give schools all the funding in the world, all the fresh fruits and vegetables, many of them don't have equipment, many of them.
It's right, yeah.
Yeah, they don't have the space, staff are not necessarily trained, so it's not enough to just think about getting the help. Schools, so many of them just don't have capacity to do anything with it and rely on the plastic wrapped food that they just stick right in the oven because that's all they have capacity.
We even have schools around the country with greenhouses now. I actually used to work in New York City and did some work in health and food policy at the local levels, and got to see schools in Brooklyn that have greenhouses so that students can grow food and also understand it. And that's a huge piece of the educational component that's really important, is that understanding early and early to connect to the food system so that they understand it's there. A little bit of a tangent there.
Wonderful. I think we're at time, so please join me again in thanking Alexandra Bookis. Thanks for our good sponsors, the Art Law Society, and again, thank you for attending our last event of the year and good luck with finals.